welcome once again to another episode of our series of videos and podcasts. Today we welcome Tonita Gonzales again, traditional healer and director of Tonantzin Traditional Healing, as well as director of the RAISES Community Education Organization. Today we're going to discuss the topic of religion and spirituality in Curanderismo and other traditional medicines. But once again, welcome Tonita, and I just want to get us started with a little bit here, and on the topic of religion and spirituality. It's a big part of healing. In my field of psychology, psychotherapy, counseling, I have found it interesting that these type of topics, how they were cut out of the healing and treatment process, or to even just understand people and their behaviors. Oddly enough, as we know, the word psyche itself used to mean spirit. Now they've changed the word to be more scientific, to be of the mind or of the brain, now with neuroscience and those sorts of things. And because of these shifts about what science is about, it was just redefined. And although more recently spirituality has returned back, because people have called out and said, we need this. This is part of who we are. One example is just like Buddhism and meditation practices that have been incorporated into Western therapies and treatments. And so it's been Americanized, of course, but it's still, again, a big part of all people. What I find most interesting, as I mentioned, neuroscience is like you can actually measure how spirituality and religion actually shifts our neurons and those sort of things. And so I wanted to talk about it. Like, what is your perspective in Curanderismo and traditional healing? How does that play a role in the traditional practices?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think this is a great topic that we all need to understand, because I think it's often misunderstood. And I think, again, as I agree with you, we were kind of taught that the best way to be is to merge into one culture. And kind of what we were all taught is that one way of teaching was Christianity. And that this was the way because it was merged with the European colonization, and there wasn't a lot of understanding. And what we found, I think, throughout traditional medicine, and if we go back to what we had talked about before, is that we know traditional medicine was in every culture. It was in every practice. It was the way that we ate, the way that we breathed, how we fed ourselves in mind, body, and spirit, what we listened to, what we heard, what we consumed, and what those practices are. And I've always found in my practice, and especially as I apprenticed predominantly in Mexico, but I think what I apprenticed living by example with my parents and my grandparents is that everybody was accepted. Meaning that I would never, if you were going to be somebody who practiced healing work, our doors were turned away. Nobody was turned away. You welcomed everybody, regardless of their religion. And we would hope that they would come with their religion and spirituality. And in my practice alone, I've seen everybody from Druids to Muslims to Catholics to everything you can imagine. Mm-hmm. And it's often fascinating to me, because it's the more that I've learned also from my patients and from community and studying spirituality, but also I think that critical is me working on my own spirituality, because I think it's a continual process. So as patients that come to me or clients, I think in any subject, not just in religion and spirituality, whether it be sexuality, whether it be their social status, whether it be wherever they're at, you have to be open to hear how that's in their life without judgment, right? Because as a person that's coming to support somebody in their healing, you have to create a safety container where they're not judged for who they are. And we can hear some of the most wild stories, but that's their story. And we can't change their story or change their dialogue or change their way that they've been taught. Mm-hmm. If somebody comes to me that's of a different spiritual practice than I am, a lot of times you'll find a lot of it is similar. They might have a different name for the holy, whether they resonate in Buddhism, whether they're Muslim, whether they call him Allah or God or Jesus, however that resonates to them, they may just call it creator, as many of our religions. A lot of times the emotional process of how you heal and that faith and that culture that come through that are also part of spirituality is very important for who they are. So to think that you're going to offer them something different, or that say, oh, your parents got it wrong, your culture got it wrong, your teachers got it wrong, is really, I think, abusive. Because you're not going in to support them of where you're at that moment. It's that you're asking them to change. Whereas to really nurture somebody is to nurture where they're at and to help educate or give them another perspective. So I might often say, in my teachings, this happened. But I also think even in our own, because we've been isolated from our own culture, there's a lot of misunderstandings. I was brought up Catholic. And I do still consider myself a Catholic. However, I also have a lot of relatives and family members and people in our community that have been very traumatized by Catholicism. And then there's been a lot of lack of understanding of Catholicism. And I think we see it a lot here. For example, in New Mexico, you'll see it in a lot of homes and you'll see it in a lot of houses, is the Santo Niño de Atocha. I saw it in my grandmother's, and it's basically baby Jesus sitting in a chair, and on one hand he has a staff with a gourd, and in another hand there's a basket. And I grew up most of my life knowing it was baby Jesus, but not knowing that the baby in Chimayo here in New Mexico, we say, you'll see the shrine of the baby, and I know you've been there, and there's lots of shoes. And I never really thought, I knew that there were miracles, and when, we've had traumas in our family, we would take, the crutches or the parts, and we would pray for people, and I got all that. But what I didn't understand, and as I learned to find out later, is the story behind that is that when you prayed to Santo Niño de Atocha, which is baby Jesus, which a lot of people think it's a whole nother saint, or they think it's like some other deity. They don't even recognize it. Even Christians sometimes don't recognize it as Christianity. But basically it's asking baby Jesus that in this gourd, I have somebody in my home that's sick, and in the gourd carries medicine. And in the basket carries food when you're hungry. Right? Which is kind of where we go in our discernment of how do we need help? Where do we go to ask for? And so a lot of the ancestry that comes through this land was that, but many people don't know the story, that it wasn't just asking for a miracle. It was maybe bring me some seeds so I could plant my own food. And how does that open up? So maybe a neighbor brings you seeds, or somebody brings you food, or somebody brings you medicine. So that's a part of our culture and our spirituality of how we come together in prayer.
Right.
And I think it happens not just in Catholicism and not just in Christianity, but in every culture. And I think we lack, because we've been so absent of understanding other cultures and religions, that those biggest judgments that we make of other people in the lack of understanding is what's harmful. And when we think about people in healing their mind, body, and spirit, the first thing to tell them is that they're wrong. I remember a great... a wonderful young man that came to me, and he's since passed, but his father was a druid, and he believed that, and I was not clearly understanding what his perspective about what that meant. And it was kind of interesting to me, because he says, I find a struggle to find peace, because some people say that and he was, in his early 30s, that he was evil because he was a druid. He says, and I grew up with the Christian understanding from my mom, and he was a druid. And I said, well, what did that mean? And he said, he always taught me that I had to know my dark side in order to be in the light. And really reframed, that's really what we all do, is finding that balance. Thank you. So I remember once that I had somebody that came for me for a consult or a plática, and one of the things that he was discerning and he was, in his early 30s, is that he was dealing with the death of his father. And he had grown up in a very Christian, gone to a Christian school, but his father was a practicing druid. And even at the time, to be honest, I didn't know a lot about that spirituality. So when I'm not familiar, I ask somebody to explain that to me, like, what does that mean? And it was really interesting because when he described the situation for him, he said, what my father knew is when he looked, because a lot of times because of our own cultural teachings, we think that dark means evil, but it doesn't. Dark can actually mean like those difficult times in our life that are dark, or like the parts that we have to know what drives us in a good way and what drives us in a bad way, or sometimes if we can't get there, what is our reaction? And these are really emotions and how we act. And he said that his father had to understand his dark side in order to live in light and to be a good person. And for me, in all spiritual circles that I've, and this was many years ago, is that if you don't understand your weaknesses, or you don't understand like where you react when you get angry, right, which is a dark emotion, then you can't understand how to work yourself out of that light. So I said, when he explained, I said, really, that's a lot the way I look at spirituality. And so it was a learning experience for me. But when I explained to him the way I perceived it and the way I understand spirituality, it really seemed like his father was a really sacred person that understood his own humanness of that ometeo, of being good and bad, dark and white, good and evil, male, female, that exists in all of us. So when we take a step away of where sometimes religion can be a trigger word, and we look at spirituality, then we're really to support people where they're at. I mean, I think we look at some great authors like Ken Wilber or even Saint Teresa Avila really talked about that there's different steps of spirituality. Or we know, like in the study of the Enneagram, that when people understand, the Enneagram was actually, from my understanding, like a Sufi tradition is where it started. But in many spiritual circles, including Christianity and Catholicism and Muslim, is that they look at this way of understanding a human being. Like where is it that they find strength and where is it that they find weaknesses? Because when you recognize your weakness, then you're able to build your strength and say, oh, it's not that I'm a flawed person, I'm a human person. And how do I make those better decisions in my life? So I think it's critical in how we support people. I think you've probably heard me a million times in saying this, but I think it's absolutely true, is that you really love people where they're at. Right? You're not, I don't love you because you're this or because, you're this great role model. It's like, love them when they aren't there. It's kind of like, or I use it a lot in reference to people that are dealing with addictions, because people say, oh, I love you out of recovery, you've done all your work, but they really need love when they're in the midst of the addiction, when they're at their worst time, like, love me then. Because when you can love somebody through all of their journey, then that's authentic love and support. You can't just be like, you're the greatest person just because you've gone through all these trials. It's like they really need more support when they're going through those trials. And that, to me, is authentic love and support.
Right. That's very different from the American idea of like, just stay positive, and which can be pretty toxic sometimes too. There's the negative in the stay positive idea.
Or also, to take it a step further, it's also bad theology, right? Because some theology teaches us that once you're a sinner and there's no redemption till you. And a sinner is a very strong word. And actually in Mesoamerica, before Christianity, the word sin didn't even exist, or illness didn't exist. What we said is that there was an imbalance. So how do you create that imbalance? Or I know even a friend of mine was telling me that in Africa, it's like when somebody's imbalanced, they would put them in the middle of the circle and they would embrace them. Right? In the midst of their storm, it's like, how do you embrace them? Rather than what we see here a lot, and in some bad theology, is like push them to the outside because they're corrupting the whole, right? Instead, you embrace that. And we really see that in our indigenous communities, in our communities. It's that saying, it takes a village, it takes a pueblo to raise a community, because how do you role model? And we, as people that are in this practice, have to role model what it is to accept people where they're at, and not just tolerate's a huge word, but say, how can I really be compassionate and understand their camino?
Yeah. You use the word ometeo. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? Yeah,
ometeo's a great, I think, word that I wish we all had a word in all of our language. I know it's somewhat similar. People will say to namaste, but basically, ometeo means I see the divine in you and the divine is in me. And it was a way that in Nahuatl that people would greet each other in Mexico. So imagine that if we all went around telling people, instead of hello, saying, I see the divine in you and the divine is in me, because then we're saying we're all holy. There's no hierarchy. And it also means in some ways that we're all male and female. We're all good and bad. We all make great choices and bad choices, because there's an honor in that sacredness of the fact that we're alive, that we honor each other. And it resonates different in our body.
Well, I mean, Curanderismo in particular takes the traditions of Mesoamerican peoples, and people often, you talked earlier about the misconceptions about the medicine and how spirituality and religion play a role. Do you have to be religious, or the common question is Curanderismo a religion?
Right. And no, for me, Curanderismo is a lifestyle. And you could be of any religion, or however that resides in you. And I don't even think the question, and it's funny because I've been questioned about this a lot, and somebody says, she has Catholic things, but she says Curanderismo is not religion. And I'm like, you can be a surgeon and be of any practicing religion, right? And the same way that you can be a practicing healer or curandera and be of any religion. The question is, how do you handle and support the people that come to you, right? That's what makes the difference. And that is not a question of religion. That's a question of spirituality. And that brings me into a whole nother subject, because I think some of the part then where I struggled with teaching is that people felt that because they had a little bit of knowledge, that then they could be wise spiritual teachers. And I think most of the amazing people that I've had the privilege of working in many different circles and many religious and healing circles is that we're never fully grown. We always continue to grow, and we always work at our own spirituality. And the way to grow in your own spirituality is really to learn about different other spiritual practices, about different other spiritualities, because that's when you actually are able to say, how am I able to support my community? But how do I grow spiritually? Because if I'm not honest with people about my flaws, about where things have been difficult for me, then it's a facade. Then it's not true. And then you're like this false prophet where everything's great. And I had a friend say, when she saw Rita and I teaching many years ago, she said, Tonita, she says, when you guys teach, she says, it just feels like wherever you guys go, the flowers bloom. And I was like, really? and it's beautiful that what she was wanting to say was that she inspired. But the reality is, life is still hard for all of us. And there are difficult things. The only difference that Curanderismo does in traditional medicine is it gives us skills and tools that give us hope, to know that in those difficult times, we will move out of that difficult time and become whole again. And it's okay for us to fall on our knees and cry and get upset and get angry and work through it, because that's part of being human. And that's what spirituality is, where you're not condemned for being human, for having flaws, or for having emotions, right? We all act and react, and we all make mistakes, and that's being human.
Yeah, so you're continuously going through changes, and that's better than being, check, I'm holy now, I'm done working on my spirituality.
Right, and what it does is it opens up to, I think, traditional medicine. When you go to somebody, and I think it should be for everybody, but I really hope it's with traditional medicine, is that you're creating a safe space for people to work on themselves to become whole without judgment. And the only way that you can do that is to constantly work on yourself.
You're bringing up a lot of things for me too, like even as we're talking about the word whole and holy and sacred. What does that mean?
Yeah. For me, I don't think that's a great question. I don't think any of us are ever whole, but I do think we're all holy. Meaning that if that's that safety container, when you recognize everybody as being holy, then you're able to embrace them as a human being. It doesn't mean you have to embrace their actions, but when somebody comes to you saying, this is causing me difficulty, doesn't mean they're opening their soul, their wholeness to you, of saying, this is all that I am. And so when you recognize that even when somebody feels their most fragmented, they are still the most holy. I mean, I think if we look at a great Christian image of Mary at the foot of the cross, right? Because even Jesus said, why have they forsaken me? right? And here's Mary at the foot of the cross, which we can imagine any motherly son connection in the midst of his most pain, judged by many, spit on, thrown stones. And she says, here is my son. And to hold him in the midst of that pain is what authentic healers have to have, that type of love and tenacity to say, I love you in all that you are, even if those values, or even if those, what you assume, because your assumptions are different, to love them for all of who they are at that moment is where healing has to happen. And I think it should happen with all people of faith, but also all doctors and healers, because a lot of wounds would be healed, because some of those same institutions are the ones that are causing most of the wounding.
Well, which brings me to the idea of like being spiritually sick or what is your perspective on that? The spiritual illness, as some people might say.
I think that, well, are you talking about in the context of what is a judgment of somebody being spiritually sick? Or do you mean as...
Well, one can be sick physically, psychologically, or even sick relationships, where we call them in pop culture toxic relationships.
Okay.
So spiritual. Some people will say like, I'm spiritually ill, or that person is spiritually ill.
Yeah, you're right. People do say that. Where I would say, no, you're spiritually imbalanced, right? Because what is happening in your life right now, there's no peace, right? And sometimes it's funny because that illness is such a strong word, but somebody will say, well, if I was, let's just say in a perspective, if I was studying, deciding to tomorrow be a Muslim, and that's my decision, some people might judge that. Or, my grandmother was a Sephardic Jew. If I study that, it's like, am I confused and spiritually sick? No. Or do I have an illness? It's like, I'm trying to better myself in understanding the wholeness of who I am. And so a lot of times when people did things differently, or they, didn't understand. And where we see this a lot, and this is a good question, is people that are dealing with mental illness. I remember from Santa Fe, I had a woman come to me, and she was going to take her brother out of a mental hospital. And I said, well, what is it that he's doing? And she says, well, people just don't understand him. And she says, we went for a visit the other day. She says, the truth is he does speak and hear voices. She says, and it freaks people out. But she says, I'll tell you, we went into a restaurant, a burger place, and we just literally came out of the mental health facility. She says, we go up to order, and my brother reaches, I'm so sorry you lost your brother. Can I give you a hug? I said, and what happened? And she says, the woman just started weeping, and her brother had died 2 days earlier. Now, most people have judged this man as having a mental illness, that he's a sociopath, right? Or he has psychotic episodes. And the reality, he was medicine for this woman. And sometimes when people will call that a spiritual illness because they don't understand how his brain and his gifts and his functionality are different from what we are calling normal, right? So is it actually a spiritual illness? I mean, I think there's so many levels to that. And I think that where if it comes in judgment and you don't understand how he sees the world. I'll give you another example. We just talked to a good friend of mine, and you might relate to this. She's an artist, and her son's a very, very gifted artist, and I've always loved his art. And he's just this raw, amazing artist, because when you see his work, you see through his eyes. Now that he's been in his academic career, you take a look back and say, how has his art changed or conformed to the way the professors wanted to see it, as opposed to his own way of seeing it? And I say this is a lot like spirituality and religion, right? How does that come from within? Because if we honestly say, like Ometeo, the holy's in you and the holy's in me, the holy's already in this person to develop and evolve. They're never left alone. It's like, I have another great friend, teacher, Sister Antoinette. She was a Canossian nun here, and actually you were with us when we went to a Taze prayer. It's a French way of praying by chanting. And at the end of our conversation, what Sister Antoinette said was beautiful, because everybody started singing in their own drumming or their own culture, their own language. And she says, what I loved about this group of people, she says, is that they were Saint Paquita. I don't know if you remember this, because I think it changed my life. She says, all these wonderful people are like Saint Paquita. And I looked at her. She says, Saint Paquita knew God before she even knew the word God. And it just broke me open to think, this is what a real healer does. This is what real people should do, is to say they knew the holy before even somebody had to say they were holy, right? She said, even though you all come with different colors, different races, different sexualities, the holy is in all of them, and they already know the holy, right? The holy doesn't have to come in this way, but like Saint Paquita, they knew the holy since before. And the reason why she says that is Saint Paquita, she's the first African saint. They say, when did she know the saint that God existed? Is that she was in the middle of the grass and she came up in front, and her brother had been gravely attacked by a lion. But when she came to the lion, she said the lion just looked at her and gazed, and she didn't know whether to be afraid. And she said the lion bowed to her and turned and walked away. And at that moment, she knew that there was a holy presence there, which was God. And that was her language. But we would see that in any culture, in any country, in any spirituality. And that is the holy in the midst. And I think when we're able to support people in their journey, that's what we want them to know, regardless of their language or how they call it, but that they too are holy.
Well, what are some spiritual practices that are pretty common within Curanderismo or other traditional ways?
Well, it's funny because I've been playing with this, and you and I know these are coloring, and in many cultures, many indigenous communities, these exact beads are actually a sign of protection. But I always play with them because I go into other circles and people will see them as Buddhist beads as they meditate, right? But I also, and for me, is very similar to the rosary, because they're all chanting the same chants and praying. So a lot of times, regardless of the religious formation, you see different ways of praying and different way of being honored. As a matter of fact, to go back to Saint Paquita, when I was in Italy, I had the privilege of teaching there. It was one of the things that she made for the children in the school she worked at. And they were good beads, she called them. So these kids were taught that every day they would do a good deed, they'd slide the bead to the other side. And she would make these so that she was teaching them kindness and humility, right? Without even having to use the word God. It's all about consciousness. So that's like one example. The other thing I think that is common with all spiritual circles that I know of are candles, right? It's light. It's like, how do you bring that blessing? Because as we know, like when we are in the sweat lodge and it's completely dark, you see that one tiny glimpse of light, and all of a sudden you can see, right? It's just like, it's the strongest beam. And I think every single one of us are a point of light. And how we use candles to represent that beautiful way of saying we are all holy.
Well, what would you recommend to someone who is at a point of exploring, or when they know that they're ready to even explore the depths of spirituality or religion, or how does someone reconnect to these things that maybe they lost at some point?
Yeah, I don't think there's ever a time. I think we, throughout our life, I mean, it could be as simple as in a coffee shop that somebody says something they knew or part of their story, and we honor that. I think it's where we're called to always have sacred listening, right? That Spirit speaks to us in so many ways and come to us. I mean, it could be in the purr of your cat, right? That somebody, that tenderness that when you need. But I also think it's a lot of research, and it's a lot of loving without judgment, right? When you can hear their story and remember that it resonates with you. I think for me, what's important and critical in this conversation is that if you are going to support community or be a community leader or be a practitioner of traditional medicine, you must continuously work on your own spirituality. Because if you don't do that, it becomes toxic. And really, in some ways, you become toxic to others because you're not able to create a safety container for them to be whole and free with them completely.
Yeah. Once again, we could talk about this day in and day out, and there's so many things that we could discuss. But this is a very deep conversation that should be had between people and connecting to our spiritual leaders, whether they're on the end of religion or organized religion.